Video. Oh,
Oh,
I did not hit that.
I think I did.
Oh, okay, that's fine. I was like, oh gosh, it's possessed.
I know I did. I don't.
Jatia Wrighten. Dr. Jatia Wrighten is a professor of political science at VCU, one of my colleagues. And she's also a scholar, not just of critical race theory, but of the role of Black women in politics. And so she's in a great position to speak to us tonight about the role that critical race theory has played in recent events in our culture of this past year, but more generally, the role that race has played in politics in America. So thank you for being here tonight. Welcome, Jatia Wrighten.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
All right.
Well, we are so excited to have you. I can't wait to have this conversation. And so I get to ask the first question. So
Perfect.
Can you describe for us what you know about faith and how you came to know it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's first important to just identify that I believe that faith and religion are two very separate things. So for my understanding of faith is really how people or individuals interact with each other on an everyday basis, and their understanding and acceptance and respect that they have for those individuals. And so for me, the way in which I have come about understanding faith or the way in which I sort of move through life has a lot to do with my upbringing in the military. So my dad was Army. We moved every 3 years. I lived on different bases. I have lived overseas. I have met so many different types of people throughout my life. And these experiences have really led me to have a understanding and respect for people who are different than me. And I think that's, what I carry into my research. That's how I interact with individuals. And even when I don't understand exactly where they may be coming from, I think at the core of human nature it's so similar, right? We all want to be loved. We have basic needs that need to be met. And at the end of the day, we really just want to move through our lives and be happy and whole people, whatever that may mean. And that's the way in which I understand faith and really how I have raised my children or raising my children. And I really think that has a lot to do with just my interactions as a child with people who don't look like me. And so I have been very fortunate to have those experiences that have really led me to this point in my life. And that's how I understand faith.
Thank you. Can I ask a quick follow-up question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there like a particular memory or two you would be willing to share? So my mom was an Air Force kid. So like I hear these stories from her a lot. So I know that there are like particular stories about locations. Are there a few that were like really formative in that?
Yeah, I think, so my dad was stationed in Munich in Germany. And we also lived in Darmstadt in Germany. And so if you can imagine, as a Black child in Germany in the 90s, that's not super common, especially because my parents lived off base. So even though, my dad was in the Army, we lived on the economy. And so I was able to actually interact with German children who went to German school, who spoke German.
Oh, wow.
And so, I spoke German enough to sort of interact as a child, right? Took it through college, don't remember most of it. However, I think that's important, learning different languages, trying foods, being really immersed in someone else's culture, while also maintaining your own is such an interesting and dynamic experience where you're learning from that person and then they're learning from you. And I think as a child, you're able to really not hold a lot of these preconceived notions about people that you start to have as you get older. And so my formative years were really formed at this point where I was able to get to know people and really experience how other people live without all of these preconceived notions or implicit bias that a lot of adults struggle with. And I think that has really set the foundation for how I approach situations and people with respect first, because I want to learn, because I noticed that as a kid, like this German child likes to play soccer or they like to eat ice cream, just like American kids do. So I think that really does set this, idea in your mind that people are not so different, right? Kids, a lot of the interactions I had as a child, there were so many similarities that it really was surprising to me, because I was like, oh, they have so many things in common like we do. And so, that I think would be, number one. But then also number two, which I think is important to mention, is that I grew up in a family where my dad, who raised me, is white, my mom is Black, and my two brothers are biracial. And so race was always on the table in terms of conversation because this is something that we always had to confront as a family, right? So like if we went to a restaurant, they would say like, are you two together? Pointing to me and my mom. And then my dad and my brothers would they'd be like, are these two separate parties? Like, what's going on here? And so I think too, like as a child, not only experiencing, diverse cultures and foods and realities, but then also my own reality was one which we had to talk about race in our family because it was something that we had to deal with at a very young age. The fact that my father was not Black, that my brothers were biracial, what does that mean to us out in the world? And my parents did a really, really good job of ensuring that we know who we are, as individuals, but also how we sort of are seen by people outside of our family. And that's really important to really form like a sense of self that allows me to be confident enough to be respectful and to be open and to be understanding of different people. And I think that's really, these two experiences, growing up in diverse cultures, but then also living in my own diverse culture of, my family, has really made the difference in how I see people and how I understand faith.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you.
And before I get to the next question, let me just echo what Keli put into the chat there. If you're listening to this and you have a question forming as we're talking, feel free to use the Q&A to type that out. And Christine and Tia and I will definitely address that as the hour progresses. So Tia, you've addressed a little bit of this already, but I wanted to probe a little further. You described growing up surrounded by different cultures and races and differences and learning how to accept all that. We just went through a really divisive election here in Virginia where critical race theory became this wedge into a whole lot of issues that people really got excited about or angry about. And I know that you've been interviewed about this topic in multiple media outlets and that you've studied it. I wanted to ask you, as you were watching this debate about critical race theory unfold here in Virginia during the last election, what was your reactions and how did your faith or your sense of faith inform what was happening and what was really at issue for people with critical race theory?
Right. I think first it's important to define just briefly what critical race theory is for listeners who are not as familiar with it. I'm sure you've heard it, but maybe you don't really necessarily understand what it is. So generally speaking, right, critical race theory is a theoretical framework that's really applied at, higher ed level. So we're talking, at this college or graduate level, and it really is suggesting, or these authors, are suggesting that racism is embedded in American institutions, and the way in which we should study these institutions or interactions or occurrences really has to include this idea, because if it doesn't, you are missing something, right? And that's really the core of critical race theory. It came about in the late 70s. It was primarily applied to the legal system, which, if you're paying attention, you should realize, embedded within the legal system is racism, from the judges to the sentencing to the policing aspect of it. And so, the justice system may seem a bit easier to see instances of racism that are built into, laws and the regulations and restrictions surrounding the legal system, but it has grown to include all sorts of different institutions in America. And so that's just really what critical race theory is. It is a theoretical framework that can be applied to a number of different institutions and understandings. And what these scholars were saying is that it's absolutely necessary to do so if you want a more full, nuanced understanding of race relationships in America, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that critical race theory is not and has never been taught at the K through 12 level, especially in Virginia. And the reason I say especially in Virginia is because I think oftentimes we forget Virginia is a Southern state, right? So there are some, I think, misunderstandings about where we stand as a state in terms of the South and its progressivism or its, ideals surrounding how we teach history and race and racism. So that's the second thing, right? So I think with these two really important points, then we can start discussing why critical race theory became so important in the gubernatorial race and why it was so effective. And really what it boils down to is that critical race theory was being used as a dog whistle for a lot of white Americans who were very uncomfortable with the progress or progression that we've seen in the past couple of years. And I would say even starting with Obama in 2008, right? So if you look, history is very cyclical, and we've seen this pattern before where we see some progress and then we see a lot of pushback. And I'll give you an example. So after the Civil War, we saw Reconstruction, which Reconstruction lasted about maybe 8 to 12 years. And at this point in time, we saw Black men gaining, seats in Southern state legislatures. This is even to this day, that was a time period where we saw the most Black men elected ever in a Southern state, right? So this period of time lasts about 8 to 12 years. The Freedmen's Bureau is begun, is founded, and it's supposed to address, white and Black families who are impoverished or affected by the Civil War. And so you see like there's this progression to sort of right the wrongs of enslavement.
Yeah.
After Reconstruction, we see Jim Crow. Mm-hmm. Jim Crow lasts 100 years, right? So there is a obvious pushback to this progression. And what it really boils down to is this fear that Black and brown people, others, right, were in some ways gaining rights or access to resources that white Americans felt were primarily theirs, right? That's really what it boils down to. In some ways, these undeserving brown and Black people were accessing our resources, our public goods, and we have to do something to ensure that this doesn't continue to happen. Enter Jim Crow. We can see the same sorts of things happening right now as a result of the election of 2008 with Barack Obama. So when Barack Obama was elected, and even though we don't see maybe some of the same progressive policy, because as you guys know, in 2010, the Tea Party came in and effectively rendered Barack Obama ineffective in trying to get policy passed, because really their main point was, we are not going to let Barack Obama and his Democrats do anything while he has his, finishes out his time in as the president. And so even though it's not as obvious, like the progression that's being made, the idea is that Barack Obama is symbolic in that all of a sudden a Black man was able to gain access to the White House, the most powerful position in the United States. Right. And so this ends in 2012. And then you have, 2008. No, he gets elected in 2012. This ends in 2016. And then you have Donald Trump, which would be the exact opposite of a Barack Obama. Right. So, and even in this election, you see these opposing forces at work, where I think in a lot of ways, Donald Trump was elected because many white middle-class Americans, or even maybe white Americans more generally, felt that Black and brown people undeservedly had gotten too far ahead, had gotten ahead of themselves, really, right? That Barack Obama symbolized this acceleration or progressivism that many white Americans were not prepared for.
And so the parents that are putting the brakes on critical race theory feel the same way that we
exactly.
Yeah.
So all of this lends itself to then critical race theory. And what's really interesting is that critical race theory, it wasn't even very popular anymore as it relates to like a theoretical framework in the academy. So yeah, it's interesting, right. I had to go back and really be like, wait, what was critical race theory? Because it's been such a long time that, I was familiar with it. I remember reading about it in grad school, but it really has not, it's so interesting to me that it's been, sort of plucked out of academia as this, signal or sign like this. Listen, we have to fight against this because we don't know what's going to happen if we continue to let, Black and brown people sort of progress. And I really think the like igniter, if this makes any sense, would be like the 1619 Project, where there was this huge push to tell real life history, right? We're not going to romanticize anymore. Yeah. We are going to tell people Pocahontas was a child, that this was not a love affair, right? Disney has it wrong, right? We want to tell the truth. And I think with this 1619 Project and with Donald Trump sort of, you know, undertaking this push to say, this is not right. We need to be wary of this sort of push to tell real history. You know, who are we going to offend? This idea that, you know, white children in our schools are going to be offended by listening to real history really was an effective strategy. And the thing about it is it's not a new strategy, right? If you think about the Southern strategy in, you know, during Jim Crow, education was one of those pieces that are really effective because number one, moms, right? So it activates women because women are oftentimes charged with the education of their children. And so if you want women to come out in droves to support something, you talk about education because women in education and their children is really a priority in terms of policy. And so if you're trying to figure out how do I mobilize middle-class America, white moms, it's education. And so critical race theory was really effective at really mobilizing this group of people, of women who in the previous election had voted for Obama, right? And so now they're activated in a different way where they're telling you, hey, listen, I know you voted for Obama, but these Democrats are really getting crazy with this critical race theory and your children are going to learn about things that you're going to be very uncomfortable with. And that was a very, very effective strategy. And that's what we saw happening in the gubernatorial race. In terms of how I approach this with faith, and this is a really interesting, I think, way to go about it, is that as a researcher, because I research things that hit so close to home, I really have to have two separate identities or two separate selves when I do this research. And then when I like go home and talk to my family about what's happening, otherwise I would be I wouldn't be able to talk about it in this way where I can sort of pull myself and like have a bird's eye view of this topic, because as you can imagine, you know, it not only hits home for me as a Black woman, but also as a mom of, you know, children in a public school system. I have all of these, you know, very personal reactions to it. And so in terms of faith, I always think about, this is what I always try to say to myself, is that there are more people who want to do good than bad. That's sort of where I try to first start, to try to think about why are people reacting this way to information that doesn't necessarily seem to me to be harmful to you as an individual, right? And that's really what I have to ask myself. And I always come back to it, there's some sort of fear coupled with ignorance, coupled with their lack of experience that makes this an effective strategy. And in reality, you know, in all of my readings and all of the research that I've done, until we address racism in a meaningful way, we are going to continually find ourselves right back at this place where we say, why does this continue to happen, right? And so that's also, you know, my faith really motivates the type of research that I do, because I need my kids to know that there are people out here who want to do more good than bad, that want to protect them and not harm them. And because of this, that's what forwards me and pushes me to, you know, do talks like this, to discuss this type of topic, because honestly, it's an emotional undertaking for me as an individual to try and even, you know, it's hard for me sometimes to be like, people don't care. People are racist. Why do we live in a world that looks like this? Sometimes that is very difficult to get over when you have to, you know, when I live in the body that I do, right? And so that's the other, I think, thing that I, you know, struggle with, but faith absolutely helps me get to a place where I can talk about this in a academic way, but also in an effective way. And I honestly believe that is my gift, my talent from God, is that I am able to talk about it in a way that people find relatable, that people understand. And my way of talking about it may not be like always super academic-y. I may not always be, you know, exactly using the right words, but I do think it's important in the way in which I talk about it. And my experience is important And that is faith. I know that God has placed me in this position because of what I have to share in my experiences. And I just continually try to come back to that piece. And that's really how I approach, this research on critical race theory, because otherwise it is exhausting. It's an emotional undertaking. And I have to take breaks. I still have to take breaks from it, but it is absolutely, faith that drives, this need for me to be able to talk about it and research it.
I appreciate you sharing all that and being so open with that and for sharing your vulnerabilities with it too. That's really, Christine, isn't that awesome?
No, it's amazing.
Have that in this space. Yeah.
It's amazing. And it's, being willing to share that vulnerability and being bold and strong in that sort of way is the sort of thing that probably makes you really relatable, right? That like, if we say, like, instead of entrenching down in the way that you're talking about, we actually say, I'm a person, you're a person, right? So to sort of circle back to that memory you're talking about, where you're like, this German kid's like soccer, right? Right. That sits at sort of the core of who you are. And so that just sort of radiates out, makes it wonderful sense. Thank you.
Or two, just also that, like she shared that being a woman and being a mother, to understand what other mothers are going through when they're vulnerable to these appeals, protect your family from everything that's happening out there. More white women voted for Donald Trump than Hillary Clinton. Remember that.
Absolutely.
So why is that? So, but Tia, you put your finger right on the pulse here when you talk about the intersection of all of these roles and identities that we're all contending with. Right. And you're in a unique position to be addressing all that, personally and professionally.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and it makes me sort of think about so we've been talking a bit about the faith piece of it, but like the culture piece of it too, right? Because there are sort of multiple competing cultures where you find yourself at this intersectional point of these identities, right? That are making sort of claims. But given your relationship and expertise on critical race theory in particular, like one of the things in our previous talks we often talk about is a culture is known through its values, its traditions, achievements of a group.
Right.
So what are the cultures of people who are supportive of critical race theory, or at least what critical race theory represents? Because again, it's like not new academic. It was, I will just say, a strange thing to have bubble up.
Yeah.
But what are also the cultures of those people who are weary of it? Like if we sort of talk about, because you've talked about these moms, and I think there's a culture around white moms like me who, like might have gone, instead of being like, yes, we should definitely talk about that.
Right. I think, okay, so this is the way I sort of addressed this question or broke it down. So first of all, the way in which I think about it, which I don't know if this is it's probably not very common to think about it this way, but the way in which I think about why or what values or what sort of culture would be supportive of critical race theory, and then sort of what, makes up or characteristics of people who may not support critical race theory. I actually thought of it as it relates to religion versus faith, but then also, so Supreme Court justices, and I know this seems like a tangent, but I promise I'll circle back. So Supreme Court justices are oftentimes considered like apolitical, which we know that's not the case, right? Because presidents choose a Supreme Court justice that's going to be similar to them or their policy. Right. And so even though they're not considered partisan, they do have an ideology. And so oftentimes you can say like, Clarence Thomas is a conservative, Sotomayor is is progressive, or, is more liberal. And so one of the things that I think about, like when studying Supreme Court justices, is that there is an idea about how these justices interpret the Constitution. So a conservative justice thinks about the Constitution, and it's called judicial restraint, where the words on the page are exactly how the law should be interpreted. They don't consider the political climate. They don't consider the culture, the changing demographics of the country. They don't consider any of that. What they say to themselves is, this is how the framers wrote it. Now I'm going to make a judgment based on the words as they appear, whether or not this law should be constitutional or unconstitutional. On the other hand, a judicial activist will say to themselves, which is somebody like Sotomayor would say something like, I understand what the framers wrote. However, I'm going to critically think about what this law or what this writing means in 2020, or 2019. And then I'm going to apply political climate, the changing demographic, and then I'm going to say whether or not this law is constitutional or unconstitutional. And the reason I start with that is because I honestly think the difference between how people, or the characteristics that make up people who maybe support critical race theory versus people who don't, as it relates to faith or religion, are maybe people who look at the Bible and take it word for word. Mm-hmm. And it's more of this restraintist vision of what we should be understanding or following. And it's the same sort of line or thinking where people say something like freedom, God, and country, or, you know, something like that, where it's like they have embedded or mixed in their understanding of religion to patriotism, right? It's like tied in some like weird wonky way where they are taking the words directly as written, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and not really critically thinking about, wait a minute, how has the world changed? What are the demographics now? What are the different types of interactions that people have? What are the new technologies that exist? And, you know, considering all of that and then saying, so where does critical race theory fall? You know, as I think about my belief system, as I think about my faith, and as I understand the Bible to maybe be a more of a moving continuum of words that I need to, you know, process and then critically think about, they just look at the words on the page and say, this is how I understand it. And critical race theory and understanding race and racism does not fit. And I think this is also how you get white supremacy and their sort of support from biblical words that are really taken out of context, but because they're not applying like a critical thinking logic to the words, this is how you can justify sort of staying stagnant and conserving what you think really belongs to you. And at the end of the day, I think that's what it is. Yeah. It's this fear that if you can't conserve what you think is rightfully yours as a white American in this country, that you are losing something. So to them, this country is like a pie, where if I get a piece, it means I've taken a piece from them. Where for many people, I think on the other end, where there's like a you know, understanding of the Bible, and it's more of like this activist perception that the Bible can inform us and guide us, but we also need to think about maybe the demographics or the changing political climate, or, you know, these sorts of things. I think then people no longer see equity or equality as a pie. It is something that everyone deserves and is required to ensure that everyone can live, you know, their best life, right? But, you know, in you know, equality. And it's not a pie. It's not, if Dave, you know, experiences and gets to have all these freedoms, then that means that I can't, and vice versa, right? And that's, I think, the disconnect between, you know, looking at the Bible and trying to understand what it's saying and not having this space or room to maybe be more active or active in its words, like really interacting with it as an active learning, I think, space versus this, you read it, that's it. And then, you know, now you exclude a group of people. So maybe it's culture like as a fight
as opposed to culture as a dialogue, the way
right.
And like also the way you narrate it in your childhood, you know.
Exactly. Like this is mine. Like this whiteness, these privileges that I experience or I'm afforded in the United States is mine. And if I include others in it, I lose out.
You lose, but there's a lot to be gained.
Right.
So there's so much to be gained, but I want to think about this to sort of circle back to the question about like the political with Dave, because so this is why I'm so passionate as a historian, is like, you know, like there isn't, we talk about this at the seminary, like is biblical literalism, right? Like you have, or as though that's not an interpretive move already, right? But I think when you pointed earlier to like the 1619 Project, part of what was so deadly about that, right, and the fight over history, was you would unmask the gap that's there, right? If you just literally take, well, this is one thing and this is the other, what you have masked is the construction of whiteness, right? And the ways that that was embedded in the founding of this country. And you'd have to go, like, if you gave them that piece, then they couldn't just lean back on biblical literalism, right? That like it breaks the equation you're describing.
Yep. Yeah. And we have built, you know, such a culture of patriotism, really, you know, strongly based in the Bible, which I always find so fascinating. And I don't really understand, because I don't know of any other country that really does this, where, you know, your patriotism is connected to your religion or faith. But we've done this in a way where it's almost like, if you're not considered a patriot, you're also not considered a Christian. Yep. Like, it's a really interesting relationship that I think is very harmful, right? Especially in a country where we see that there's so many diverse religions and faiths that are practiced in this country, that is a really harmful connection to make. And it's very exclusive of people, you know, of people who maybe don't consider themselves Christians. And so that right there, really at the core of our American belief system, is problematic, right? And so, you know, how do you even begin to untangle this or disentangle this? And I think, you know, starting with like the 1619 Project, or even, you know, critical race theory, it begins to address some of that disentangling these two sorts of things. And I think people react in fear of that, right? Because they don't know what's going to happen, or what does that mean for them if this is how they have cultivated their identity and their culture. You know, we're taking something away from them.
Yeah.
So if I can summarize, then you're answering Christine's question like this one vision of culture as the circling of the gates, or whatever, the circling of the wagons, the closing of the gates, defending the borders. Right. And then religion is used to kind of enforce the code of what gets you in or out, versus this other idea of culture as open, porous, multiple borders, dialogues, interaction, intersectionality going on.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Trump's building the wall is really like, I mean, if that's not sort of this like biblical symbolic, like what, you know, versus this opening, or the, you know, I think there's so many symbolic aspects of Trump's presidency that were missed, because instead of people sort of saying to themselves, like, why do people who are not, you know, white find these things so offensive? Like they didn't sit down and sort of say, like, why does this seem exclusive? Why are they not celebrating, you know, the closing of borders? Why are they not celebrating, you know, this inflammatory sort of language? Like, what is going on? If we would just do that more often, right? If we would just talk to our neighbors more often and say, why are you so, what is making you so upset about this? Like, why are you finding this so offensive? But I think people are so afraid of the answer that they don't want to ask, you know, because then that would make them have to actually address their own implicit bias or not implicit bias, you know, about the situation altogether. And so we sort of start back at square one, where I think self-reflection is such a hard personal thing to do for so many people. But because we don't do it often as a country, we find ourselves in these same places over and over and over again.
Yeah. Before we get to the question in the chat, Christine, I'll let you address that one. I just wanted to share one quick story, because I know you have little kids, and it relates to what you just said about opening yourself up to critique like that. I once had a Black Lives Matter sign in my front yard, and I left the house with my son to take him to school, and he was in first grade at the time. And we're walking to the car, and this guy I didn't know in the neighborhood, I'd never seen before, walked by me with his dog and shouted out, "All lives matter," really loud and kind of like threatening. It was like 8 a.m. or 7:30 in the morning. Right. And I was startled, and my son's looking up at me like, "What's that?" Now I got another problem. Now I'm in the car driving to school, and I have to explain what this guy's reaction is to the statement, "Black Lives Matter."
Right.
And that was hard to do in 10 minutes, you know, to a 7-year-old.
Right.
But like you're saying, on a national scale, if we are not regularly taking the opportunities to go through these different attachments we have to culture as a border that we must protect versus culture as a field in which we can all interact and grow together.
Right.
Because what that guy's shouting to me said was that he had no incentive to grow in community with people who he might not agree with.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
There's no shouting back to that.
Right. What do you say?
I had to get to school.
Right. Right.
Well, and I think it actually sort of segues nicely into this question in the chat so the question's been asked, can you address the extreme patriarchy that is embedded in the version of Christianity that promotes patriotism as an expression of faith? So like, as we're thinking about patriotism, we're thinking about patriarchy and the ways in which women get consigned and also choose these roles in education, to go back sort of to earlier what you're saying, but also that it's this particular guy that's driving back. What is he defending, and what is patriarchy's role in that?
So, I mean, I don't know. So I don't know if maybe I'm not probably the best to answer in terms of in the version of Christianity that, so, okay, maybe, so I don't have specific scripture, right, points, but I will say, so I think one way in which I think about this, or like this, I mean, patriarchy, that's such an excellent point, that we find this in, Christianity, especially. I've always thought about this in a way, patriarchy in the way in which, we look at leadership in churches. Like, I was really excited and surprised to find that Reverend Keli Shipley was in charge of church, because I'm like, oh my goodness, a woman, it was very exciting. And it's also so unique. And that shouldn't be the case. Right. But I go back and honestly, I do think of churches as sort of like two different churches, like a Black church and a white church. They're very different entities. For my purposes, being in a Black church, being a Baptist in a Black church, I always think about like the role of Martin Luther King Jr. and the fact that he is a reverend, but he is a starter of a social movement for social justice. And so for me, I've always understood church as a place where you organize for social justice, that faith is something that pushes you forward to ensure that there's equality for your community, right? So that's how I've always understood church. However, in studying, the civil rights movement and in studying Martin Luther King Jr., you realize that there was so much patriarchy that existed in the Black church as it relates to the invisible women, the work that Black women did in the church, the work that they did organizing these movements. And really, Martin Luther King Jr., not to take anything away from him, but really became like the voice of the movement, where he wasn't doing this work, all of the work underneath that really was like the backbone of the organizing and pulling people together and getting people together in these spaces. And so for me, I think what is so interesting is that, in thinking about the Black church, you have this issue of racism as it relates to, discrimination against Black people, but sexism is widespread across all institutions, religious institutions, regardless of race, color, creed. And so I think, when you're talking about like the, embedded patriarchy, Black churches are not excluded from this, right? So I think that's really important to mention, that's number one. And then also it really does forward, like, I think the way in which women vote, right? Like we see, patriarchy maybe being, what is it called? Like manifested in that way where, maybe, many women weren't allowed to vote until 1920, but when they did, they voted the way their husbands did. And so there's like all of these connections, I think, and I mean, those are only like very, very few. So if you two have anything else to add, I mean, I think that there's so much there that I never really thought about it to sort of unpack it in this way, but there's absolutely a line that's drawn from patriarchy to Christianity that promotes patriotism, right? I mean, I know there's a direct line. I just don't know exactly how to draw it from one point to the other.
Well,
authority is the line.
Authority, yeah.
You described it as who's the one who's going to be the spokesperson, who's the one making decisions. Does a woman get to be in charge of a program like this or an important role in the church. And if authority is not delegated to people who are different from the ones who came before, how are we to understand knowledge and experience coming from something other than a privileged perspective?
Right. Yes,
and so
absolutely.
It's just like this gradual unraveling of our attachments to particular versions of authority.
Right.
And critical race theory, as you've described it tonight, is just one example of that, in the way that this system for analyzing racism in our institutions deprivileges people who have taken their own privilege for granted for so long.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, that's
along
perfect.
those lines with critical race theory, I just discovered another area of Zoom where I forgot to look for questions. And our rector, Charlie, has asked a question. I want to make sure I got that before I forget.
Okay.
He asked if you've been surprised by the reaction to critical race theory in academia.
Yes. So I don't know what your experience, Dave, has been, or Christine, in academia generally, but when critical race theory, when this all sort of blew up, right? Like where you're like, wait a minute, everybody was like checking back, like critical race theory, what is that? What are we doing? What is this? Yes. It was really interesting to me that because I do race, because I do Black women, because of my area of study, my department actually instituted this, like, we have to protect her from what we feel like is going to be a lot of pushback because of the area of study that she does. And so there was like an email that actually went out that was like, hey, Dr. Wrighten does all of these things. We need to make sure that she is protected in terms of, pushback from the media or from individuals in the community who may have a, difficult time with the type of work that she does. And I'm just like, when is this ever going to stop? Where, you're literally just studying in an area. And I also think it's like ironic and also frustrating in a lot of ways. So not many are familiar with my journey, but it took me 10 years to get my PhD. And a lot of the reasons why was because I started at an institution where this type of research, they told me outright, this is not political science. No one is interested in Black women. No one is interested in this type of research. Wow. This is not something that you're going to be able to carry through. It's not going to be dissertation worthy. And so I had to make a really tough decision of whether I was just going to change my topic and do something completely different, or if I was going to leave that institution after 4 years of being there, working towards my dissertation. And at the end of the day, I'm like, if I can't do this kind of work, I don't want to do it, because this is why I'm here. And so I ended up leaving and basically took like a 2-year break in between. And so it's so frustrating to me, but also very surprising that as I get to an institution, critical race theory comes up, and all of a sudden my work is like, they're like, oh my, there's just all these eyes on it. And I want to like contact my old institution and be like, oh, you thought it wasn't going to be important, did you? Yeah, yeah. But on the other hand, it's also frustrating that it's important in a way that is upsetting. It's not like this celebration of this work. It's not like this is, I mean, that's not necessarily all the way true, but in terms of like mainstream media, it's more so this like defense of this work, which luckily for me, I've been doing that for 10 years. So it comes pretty naturally to be able to defend the work, but it's just exhausting to have to do so, right? And, it's so funny when critical race theory and all of this came out, I actually started going through different theoretical frameworks thinking like, okay, what could be next? Like, what do I need to know? Or like, make sure that I'm not like, saying it too often or, whatever the case may be, because it really did take me by surprise. But I also think, I appreciate the reaction of my department, but I also think it's unacceptable that that's something my department has to even contend with. And I think it's unacceptable that it's something that I have to contend with, like how community members are going to act or react to this really, really important, interesting work, because heaven forbid, there may be like a mention of critical race theory, somewhere embedded in this research. And so absolutely a surprise. I think on the the silver lining is that my work is getting a lot of attention. And as a first year coming out of grad school, this is awesome. But it's also like, it's unfortunate that this is like sort of what the work is this like defense, but also this like, I think there's also opportunities like this one to educate, which is great. But yeah, I think it's very surprising. It is very, very surprising. We don't really even teach this critical race theory anymore. Because it's a 70s framework, and there's so many frameworks that have really expanded and developed and evolved from critical race theory, that we really use this as sort of like historically, this is what we did, but now we look at this. And so, yeah, it's just, it's fascinating.
It's a blessing too. I mean, like you said earlier, you were meant to do this.
Yeah.
It's your calling, and you have this gift of being able to speak in these different registers to the subject. And to answer your question directly, no, I didn't get a similar memo.
No.
When I started teaching in the jails, the only time it came up with regard to that was when some of the people that I was working with got into trouble again with the law.
Right.
And suddenly there's news stories and my name is attached to the news story.
Oh, right. Okay.
So there was that, and there was jeopardy.
Right.
Mildly. I'm not going to diverge into that whole story, but it was really difficult for a good year when my name was attached to the names of people that I would never have known otherwise if I hadn't tried to teach them how to write.
Right. But I think that's also part of the blessing too, of being an academic, is that I've always wanted to be an activist in the community and an academic. Like, I don't do this work so that other, academics can read it. I mean, that's great, but I do this work because I saw that there's a problem and an issue and disparity and inequality in my communities. And that's the reason I do the work. And so this is excellent, this ability or this opportunity to be able to educate and help and hopefully achieve, some of these goals. And so, yeah, I mean, I feel like maybe if you don't get critiques or criticisms, you're not doing something right. Right. I mean, I think that's sort of the takeaway, is that if people aren't saying things that aren't great, you probably haven't said anything worthwhile then. Right?
Yeah. You haven't found like the tender points or the
right.
Exactly.
I
will just say, so when I first started my job, there was a lot of like, what is history for? Why is it important? And I was very similar. Like, I teach ancient history, right? But I was like, no, the questions are relevant. The facts we pick up, the stories we tell, right? Like, this has ethical import. I always tell my students, that's like my spiel, is like, history telling is an ethical act. Yep. But like, there's also, at least for me, and I've thought a lot about this in relation to my faith, so I'd be interested in hearing from you, like the sorrow and the joy. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, it's a both and, because you're talking, but there's opportunity, but it's also like, I would just note that we've been using sort of this language, you're made for this. We might speak about this as call or vocation, which is very sort of faith-based, religious, especially Christian language.
Right.
Like, has there been struggle for you sort of negotiating that, especially as you're talking about that sort of PhD journey?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of the reasons why I'm able to talk so well about racism and intersectionality is because I have experienced it on a pretty consistent basis. I look around my department, and I'm the only Black woman in my department. But the thing about, my sort of childhood as well, is that I was always in advanced placement classes. I was always in spaces where I was a minority, always. And so I've really learned to excel in these areas, but it definitely comes with a lot of sorrow, right? There's a lot of isolation, a lot of loneliness in people not truly understanding where you're coming from. And even though I have, friends and colleagues who are empathetic to it, it is still different than having someone being able to speak from your actual experience that you lived through. And then, and there's so much relief in being able to sit down with someone. For me, it would be another Black woman who experiences this, and then you could just sit. Like, I don't have to say anything. Like, we could just be like, like, there's so much strength and power in being able to do that versus being, having to say like, well, and even in some ways, I still have to sort of watch how I say it, how I phrase it, what I'm saying, where with someone who looks like me and who has experienced the same thing, I don't have to always be on. And if that sort of makes sense.
Totally.
So there is this like joy and sorrow. And especially like for me too, like in a classroom, like I am a very good teacher. I taught high school. I was a trained teacher. So a lot of professors are not trained teachers. So I'm like, I give it my all. Like, I'm on a basketball court. It's like sweat. I'm like, I am energetic. I love teaching. But on the other hand, because of the way I look, I have to, jump so many hoops and obstacles to basically prove to these students that I'm not only expert in the room, I know what I'm talking about. I've done this work, because it's like, they come at me already thinking like, I don't know what I'm talking about, or I'm not old enough to be there, or I'm not, I'm not skilled enough, or I'm the assistant waiting on the professor to come into the classroom. I'm the TA. Yes. And so those sorts of like microaggressions really do wear on you, even though I have, by all intents and purposes, I have accomplished a really difficult goal, which is to get a tenure track position as a Black woman in political science. Yes. That is a difficult bar. I mean, that's a hard threshold. And it's even more difficult to be able to get tenure, which is what I'm on right now. And so I know even further, like the odds are against me. I know all of these things going into this. And so even though it's fantastic, that is definitely the sorrow, which is, even as I accomplish, these amazing feats, I have to constantly prove and fight to show that I belong, that I'm supposed to be here, that I know what I'm talking about. Like, it's just, that is exhausting. And even more so because I find myself in spaces where I don't have someone who looks like me, who doesn't have that shared experience. So even when they're empathetic, I still have the work of explaining, or of, saying like, yeah, I get that, yeah, you're a mom too. Oftentimes it's like the mom or the women thing. Less often is it the Black woman thing, right? And so that is also like another layer of, you're a mom, but you're not a mom like me. Like, you don't have a Black boy that you have to say he's 11, and I know that he's like 2 or 3 good years before he's considered an adult. Like, that's not your experience. That's not your mom life, no. And so that's also like this, even though there is some commonalities, it's still different. But at the end of the day, it's like, I can still, come in contact with these people and have respect for who they are, what their life is about, and the struggles that they go through. And, that's what I would just want, is that's how we interact with everyone, that we don't necessarily know where they're coming from, but we can respect their journey, right? Because that's really, at the end of the day, what faith is.
Yes.
Well said. A couple more questions came in through the Q&A that I thought we might close with, because
Sure.
they bring us to the same place where we began, which is, how do we talk about this really difficult subject?
Right.
Why did it come up in the way it did? The first question, I'll just read them both to you, and you take them as you like. The first is, how do we address the fear that the reaction to CRT has brought to the fore?
Right.
And a second, kind of related, what should I, plain old white woman, say to explain CRT?
So the first one, in terms of fear, I have always thought, and it really have been taught, that the only way to address fear is with information and education. And so like, if you are thinking about like, how do I make a difference? It really starts with an individual, right? It doesn't have to be this like community effort. It doesn't have to be this like, huge undertaking. I really do believe that individuals can make differences, because you as an individual have relationships with people that are outside of your family, day to day, at your work, at your, doctor's office. And so you as an individual, being well-informed, thinking about how someone else may feel, being empathetic, and then arming yourself with the information that makes sense to you in a way that makes sense is enough, right? That's how you conquer fear. When I'm afraid of something or the unknown, I start to figure out like, what is the source of this fear? And then I start to do research. And I know that's like, I know that doesn't necessarily make sense, but people do that all the time that are not academics. We research all the time. That's why Google is so popular, right? We do look for answers. And so I think that's number one, is really arming yourself with information, and then maybe finding allies who are similar to the way that, similar to who you are and how you think. And then maybe making friends that don't look like you, that you can get comfortable enough to ask these questions to. Like, it's so funny, like my best friend is white. And I always say like, she can't say like my best friend is Black, but I can say my best friend is white. So like my best friend is white. And
Love
you
it.
know, we have been friends for 20 years. And when she doesn't understand something, I'm a person that she can be like, hey, I don't understand this, right? Every person needs someone like that who they can go to and be like, hey, I don't understand this. Can you please explain it to me? And I think because, you know, this really, you know, relates back to this idea that we have these like closed circles where everyone looks like us. So you don't have anybody that you can say, hey, can you explain to me Diwali? Can you explain to me like what the Festival of Lights are? Can you explain to me, you know,
Yes.
can you explain to me, are these braids or are these dreadlocks? Like you need someone that can tell you these things, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's really how we conquer fear, is with arming ourselves with information, getting to know people outside of our circles. And really, you're going to have to get uncomfortable, because there's no growth that happens without someone feeling uncomfortable. And that's okay. And then I think, you know, to the second question, critical race theory, I think is only, you know, understanding its core point is enough. So regardless if you're white, black, red, green, brown, the idea behind critical race theory is that racism exists in our institutions. And in order for us to better understand these institutions, we have to consider that point. And that's really all it is, right? And so when you're thinking about this, in a classroom setting. So I'll just give it because I'm an educator. This is an example I give, right? I had some, you know, faculty members asking me, how do I incorporate critical race theory? How do I incorporate, you know, this acknowledgement of racism? It's really not that complicated. So when I talk about, you know, the framers, I can say like they own slaves and, you know, they had weak spots, and these are just human beings, right? They should not be placed on a pedestal, just like Martin Luther King should not be placed on a pedestal. He was a great social justice leader. However, he was a terrible husband. He cheated all the time, right? Like it's you just talk about history and people the way that they actually appear. And in that way, you are actually addressing racism and sexism and these things that are built into the institutions, instead of sort of romanticizing what occurred, right? And that's the key, is that we take these people, these historians, these history makers off of their pedestals and talk about them in a way that makes sense, which is that they are human beings, they have faults, and this is what they did in history. And you've actually addressed, you know, critical race theory and racism in a way that makes sense to you. And I think if you look at your life and in your profession, you can maybe think about ways that make sense to you to sort of start dismantling some of this misunderstanding around critical race theory, just the way that you speak about things or talk about things, especially like in the healthcare system right now, there's a lot of opportunity for that, right? We know that Black women have high maternal death rates. Why, right? Why is that? If you're a nurse, you should be asking yourself, do you have implicit bias? Do you feel like Black women have higher pain thresholds, right? Is there something that you're doing that makes it so that you think about it and you're like, wait, I don't do that for white women, but I do this for Black women. Or I don't believe Black women first, but, I believe white women first. Those sorts of things, sort of looking inward is going to help, dismantle not only racism in institutions, but also really put critical race theory back in its place, which is really just a theoretical framework that can be applied to different understandings, but should not be used as a dog whistle for white supremacy.
And I would just add one thing to what you said to the person who asked, what do I say to explain this? After you do everything that Tia just said, just emphasize that it's more than individual interpersonal interactions, because we all have Black friends. I hope, or I assume, but it's not about that. It's not about interpersonal relationship, which he's addressing. And this is where I think people get vulnerable to that dog whistle thing. Their reaction to the implication that the healthcare system or education might have biases against people of color is to say, well, that can't be. I have a friend and his teacher is Black and they get along fine. Well, any explanation in the interpersonal is partial. It's nice, but it's not what Dr. Wrighten is describing.
No, that's a really good point. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Or don't say things like, well, there was a Black president, so racism doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Can't do that.
Yes. Well, I am so sad that our time has come to an end because I have been loving this conversation.
Oh, I'm so glad. It was great to speak with all of you. I'm so excited.
No,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Dr. Wrighten. This has been such a privilege and honor to like share time with you and space, even if it's virtual space with you.
Yeah.
And thank you for your vulnerability and generosity and brilliance. And I just am going to go ahead, because you mentioned the healthcare system. That was actually a wonderful segue for us for our next Faith and Culture series. So I'm going to do a little promo, everyone. So I hope that you will join us on February 9th. Our topic will be Faith, Culture, and COVID. And we will be speaking with Leonard Edlow. He is the retired CEO and pharmacist of Edlow's Professional Pharmacies, which were located here in Richmond, Virginia. He is the pastor of New Hope Fellowship in Hartfield, Virginia at the moment, and a consultant at Westwood Pharmacy. Dr. Edlow also serves as an adjunct professor of Christian ethics at the John Leland Theological Center of Ministry. In addition to his BS in pharmacy from Howard University, Dr. Edlow earned a Master of Divinity from the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia University, and a Doctor of Pharmacy degree from the University of Florida School of Pharmacy. And I know Dr. Edlow personally because he was a Master of Theology student and graduate from Union Presbyterian Seminary. So he's an alumni of fellow in the clergy in rural and underserved areas at the Center for Church and Community of Campbell University. He currently resides in Mechanicsville, Virginia with his wife, Sarita, and is the father of one daughter. So we are very excited to speak with Dr. Edlow, and I hope that you will join us again. And now I will close us out with a blessing. I thought it would be perhaps helpful to read St. Francis's prayer. So you're going to get the historian's take this evening. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love, to be loved as love. For it's in giving that we receive, and it's in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it's in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.
Hey, thanks everybody. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you again.